Hi, everybody. I am here today with Pastor Glen Scrivener from Eastbourne, England, and he and I are going to discuss really important topics having to do with human dignity and abortions and pro-life and pro-choice and the movement towards secularism and what they've called Euro-secularization, which is this idea that you're moving away from traditional religious values and towards what they call rational or scientific or postmodern values. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, but we're also going to talk about some of the pretty cool things that I've seen on his channel. He has a channel called Speak Life, and I put the link in the description, so you guys are going to want to go down to definitely subscribe to his channel. But he's also pretty well known for his debate with Matt Dillahunty. And so that was where I discovered Glenn. I was watching him on the Unbelievable channel do a rock star job debating Matt Dillahunty. And then I actually listened to the debate over a couple of times. I've actually listened to it a few times. I've reviewed it. And then I listened to Glenn's review of the debate. And he also caught some really good points. And I still chuckle about that Gregory S. Paul portion of the debate. I haven't seen Matt use that ever since. I don't know if he has or not, but I haven't seen him mention.
That'll be the last time, I think.
So without further ado, let me ask Glenn to introduce himself.
Hello, yes, I'm Glenn. Great to be on your channel again, SJ. Yeah, we talked about the Matt Dillahunty debate, I guess, back in, well, a year ago, probably, because that's when that debate came out. But I am Emma's husband. I'm Ruby and JJ's dad, and I live on the south coast of England. I'm from Australia originally, but I've lived half my life in the UK now. And I'm kind of a preacher and writer and shoot my mouth off about Jesus. That's my job, so I love that.
Yeah, and you do a really good job. I mean, I have to say the sermon, I think it was a sermon that I was watching, I'm pretty sure that I was just watching today, and you were talking about things like the parable of the talents, but you had some insight into the parable of talents, because I just spoke about that yesterday. That's the coincidence. I had a YouTube channel thing that I did on Cain and Abel, and I also brought in the parable of the talents, because I think that's a fascinating parable that tells us that we are expected to invest in our talents. But you were looking at the person who didn't, who dug his head in the sand, and really saying that it wasn't so much about investing in the talents, but you were talking about his view of the master. And I wanted to see if, before we get into this other conversation, if you wanted to mention to our crowd here what you said.
Well, it's interesting. For those who don't know the parable, Jesus gives people different amounts of money, and the currency that was being used was called talents, and that's why today we think of talents in this sense of a gift or an ability that's given to us. But Jesus in the parable is basically having, a master gives some money to different people, 10 lots of talents and 5 lots of talents and 1 lot of talents. And the person who just has one thinks of the master as miserly, as dishing out his blessings with a teaspoon and a scowl. And what's interesting is by the end of the parable, he kind of gets the Lord that he had imagined. He imagined the Lord to be stingy. And so the Lord says, if that's really how you see me, then okay, allow me to be to you the way you have cast me. And I think that's an interesting insight into the way judgment works out in the Bible. There's this whole theme throughout the Bible of God giving us over to what we have wanted, which is an extraordinarily fair judgment, actually. What judge in a court of law gives the accused precisely what the accused wants? And yet Romans 1 sort of puts words to this thing that's all throughout the Bible, that the way in which the Lord deals with us is, kind of according to what we have foolishly grasped at, what we have foolishly wanted. There's, the old parable of the old saying of, the wicked dug a pit and then fell into it. And so we see this with this guy. He had imagined God to be miserly to him, and God says, can you really still think of me in that way? I've been giving and giving and giving, and it was fabulous wealth. Whether it was 1 talent or 10 talents, this was a lot of money that he generously bestowed. And yet, it does seem to me that you can get into this cycle in which you imagine God to be a certain way, and estrange yourself further and further from that God. You begin by imagining him to be distant, and then you find yourself to be distant from him. So yeah, that's just an interesting dynamic going on there, I think.
Yeah, and that is really interesting, and it kind of reminds me of Richard Dawkins in a way. I was thinking of the way that he's portrayed God in his book, his God Delusion book, and he portrays God as this evil Old Testament guy who's sort of after people, and if God is going to address him and answer him, I wouldn't want to be Richard Dawkins. I mean, not trying to single out Richard Dawkins, but I mean. He has this vision of God in this really nasty way, and that's sort of a lot of atheists I've seen have these visions of God in these really awful ways. They think that God is just out to punish them, and God is a God of love. And I think one of the things that I found that people who don't want to believe in God or who suppress God, because I believe Romans 1 does make it clear that God has made himself clear to them, is a lot of times they don't really look to Jesus to see this is the exemplification of God.
Right.
We have God in the flesh.
Right. And that's the problem. I mean, it happens in every human relationship. If I enter into a conversation with you, SJ, and I'm convinced you are this whatever, I could have any number of filters that I view you through. And human psychology is such that I could actually view anything you say now through those sets of lenses. We're incredibly good at these kind of biases, these prejudices that we bring into any kind of relationship. So of course we're going to do that with God, and in fact we do that with God on a much greater scale. We imagine him to be a certain way, and in the New Testament, it talks about the lie. So in the book of 2 Thessalonians, Paul talks about how we always default to the lie. And it's this sort of, capital T, capital L idea. And what is the lie? And in the context, the lie is that basically God is a miser. The lie is that God is against you and not for you. And we're always tempted to believe it. And we're always tempted to come to any revelation of God through that lens. And so when we come to Jesus, we get a very different kind of image of God. This is what Jesus is presented as. He is the image of God, Colossians 1, or he is the exact representation of God, Hebrews chapter 1. Or he constantly calls himself the Son of God, which, among other things, means that he is a chip off the old block. He is exactly like his dad. And in all that he does, he is expressing the true name and nature of God. And then if we can just put our prejudices aside and come to Jesus, then we see a God unlike anything the world has ever imagined. He's a God who pours himself out with every drop of his blood, dying with his arms outstretched to his enemies, praying, Father, forgive. And, I as a preacher, I'm often speaking in very evangelistic settings. I'll go to university campuses and preach to people. And quite early on, what I want to say to people is, hey, when I say God, I am picturing a human sacrifice with his arms outstretched to the world, bleeding for his enemies, praying, Father, forgive. Just so we're on the same page, just so we understand, when I say God, I'm thinking of Jesus. And in particular, I'm thinking of the Jesus who bled for his enemies. Is that the God you're thinking of? And that's the big question that is always at the heart of every kind of encounter. It's, if somebody says they believe in God, okay, which God? Which God are you talking about? If someone says they don't believe in God, well, which God? Which God don't you believe in? And I don't believe in the God of the first page of the God Delusion either, Richard Dawkins, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Describe to me that God. Okay, fantastic. That sounds like Thor. I don't believe in Thor. Can I tell you about this one? Can I tell you about Jesus? And so he is this revolutionary image of God. And if we swap the old spectacles for the Jesus spectacles, then we start to see not only God, but we start to see the scriptures, we start to see everything in life in a very different light.
Yeah, and thank God we have a God who's a forgiving God, a merciful God, a loving God. I mean, imagine, you can imagine if we had the God that Richard Dawkins has envisioned,
Right.
that would be pretty awful. But we have instead a very just God. Like you said earlier, God gives us what we ask for. And so
Yeah. I remember I was speaking to a woman from Iran. I was on a university campus. I was speaking every evening, and she came along and she was taking copious notes. at all my talks. And I got to talk to her on the second or third night. And I said, "What's your story?" And she said, "Well, I've come from Iran. I grew up going to the mosque, saying the prayers, all in Arabic. I don't speak Arabic, but I knew them off by heart." She was an observant Muslim. And aged 14, her uncle came up to her at a wedding party and kind of said, "Here, read these." And he pressed into her hands a copy of the Gospels. Because in the Quran it says, read the Injil. And so he said, be a good Muslim, read about Jesus. And so she did. And she said she got halfway through Luke's gospel. And she said, "I realized that God could not be the God of the Ayatollahs. He must be the Jesus God." And I just love that phrase, the Jesus God. I've been using it ever since. And it's just this idea that whatever cultural understandings of God that she had absorbed, they were just being blown out of the water by the towering personality, the stooping love of Jesus. And at the end of the day, she looks at him and she says, whoever else God is, he's got to be this guy. If he's not this guy, he's not worthy of the name God. But here is, with Jesus, here is the God who is worthy of the name, the Jesus God. So that's kind of what I think evangelism constantly is. It's constantly pointing back to Jesus and saying, what about him?
Yeah, and I think I think the reason why you can believe that it's Jesus is because we find that we have this morality, these desires to do what's right, and we desire to do what's just. We know in our hearts sometimes we need to forgive people, and a lot of the attributes that we know that aren't easy, the hard attributes, like you should forgive people who've sinned against you. You should trust people. I mean, there's all these different things. You should tell the truth. You should be loving, benevolent, all those kind of things. We're drawn to be that way. And we have this objective standard. And then you look and say, well, where did this standard come from? Why is it transcendent to cultures and times and all that kind of stuff? And you realize it has to be transcendent. So it has to come from a source. And then you look back in history and you can see when people sort of realize, wait a second, neither slave nor free, all that kind of stuff. We're all one in the eyes of the Lord. And so I think that's so important. And I think, I think you and I have talked about Tom Holland's book and how the world has changed a bit since Christianity.
Just a bit. It's the revolution that has remade our world on completely different lines. Because, even on something like truth, well, the Persians were into the truth and the lie. And they spoke in those categories quite a bit, and certainly no one can spend any time with Greek philosophy without seeing that Plato and Aristotle and others had a very large place for truth and falsehood, and for Plato, he kind of had this idea of the ideas that in the ideal realm there are things like truth and goodness and beauty, but in quite impersonal ways. What the real revolution of Jesus is this idea of redemption and forgiveness, which is the first thing you mentioned, SJ. And I think that is what speaks to the heart in a way that condemns us and then raises us up again. Because actually my heart is not oriented towards forgiveness. My heart is oriented towards tit for tat. You do me down, I'll do you down. But, it's an eye for an eye until the whole world goes blind, as sort of Gandhi riffed on the Sermon on the Mount. And so just think of this very human situation in which, you're having an argument with someone you love. And all of a sudden in the heat of battle, suddenly you find yourself saying things that you could never have imagined you saying. And you're thinking to yourself, I don't know what's coming over me. And of course, nothing's coming over you. It's all coming out of you. It's all coming out of somewhere very dark. And then the other person responds in kind, and then you respond in kind, and they respond in kind. And that's hell. And it feels like hell. And the book of James in the New Testament says that actually our tongues are a fire set on fire itself by hell. Hell is a power that we unleash on one another. And so there is something incredibly hellish about our human interactions when we just, operate according to tit for tat. But then what does it take to have reconciliation, forgiveness, a new start? Well, it takes at least one of you not responding in kind, instead absorbing the wrath and paying back with kindness and undeserved grace. It takes one of you at least to do that. And how does that feel? It feels excruciating. And I'm using all these words advisedly. Excruciating. It feels like it's from the cross. It's a cross-shaped approach. to this back and forth, but it's the only thing that brings redemption. It's the only thing that brings a fresh start. It's the only thing that can undergird a true love relationship. So now, what is the Jesus story? The Jesus story is that we've been, back and forth with one another, unleashing hell on one another. We've been casting God in these negative lights and saying, get away from me, God. And then what does he do? He comes into the midst of it and he absorbs the wrath and answers with kindness. And it was excruciating for him, but it's the only thing that has brought us peace. And I think out of that revolution has been birthed a movement that has been the most transformative sociological phenomenon the world has ever seen. And Dominion is a great place to go for people to trace out the last 2,000 years and to see how that one idea has built the world that we live in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how he taught us to sacrifice, and how he taught us I think all through the Gospels and all through the Bible itself, there's this message of sacrifice that God initially wants people to sacrifice. We see it all the way back with Cain and Abel, when God appreciated or didn't appreciate Cain's sacrifice, but appreciated Abel's sacrifice. And so he wanted the sacrifice to be real, to be an unblemished lamb. At one point, he mentioned exactly what he wanted for a sacrifice. And then we have Jesus as the unblemished lamb that was sacrificed.
Right. And I think even going back even further than Genesis 4, in Genesis 3, I think everything is set up for us to understand Genesis 4. In Genesis 3, we've got Adam and Eve, they've sinned, but what do? They cover themselves in fig leaves, in vegetation, okay? And this is a kind of a symbol of them trying to atone for themselves. And then what do we see in the next and what do we see in Genesis 3? The Lord does not think that self-covering is adequate. He, if you like, strips away the self-covering of Adam and Eve, and instead he clothes them with skin. Well, where did the skin come from? A sacrifice, I guess. And what did that poor animal do to deserve getting killed? Adam and Eve sinned, and actually the first death is the animal, right? So the animal dies, blood is shed, and they are clothed in the sacrifice of another. All right, come into Genesis chapter 4, and what we see again is this battle between two ways of dealing with our sin. We've got Cain's way, which is a vegetable way. Okay, he brings a vegetable offering. There's no bloodshed. And he thinks he ought to be accepted by God on the basis of his doings. And it's interesting, the way Cain responds to the Lord reveals what Cain was seeking in presenting that sacrifice. He expected God to be impressed by him. And when God was not impressed, his face fell, and there was that, horrible sullenness and self-righteousness and anger. Because it's the way of fig leaves. It's the way of self-covering. Abel had invested in the blood sacrifice. And what you get set up in the Bible is this idea that sacrifice in the Bible is not the way it happens in pagan civilizations, where you identify a scapegoat in a negative sense. You identify that which is demonic and that which needs to be expunged from the community because it is guilty. And then off it goes. Actually, in the Bible, it needs to be, a lamb without spot. It's an innocent victim. And all throughout the Old Testament, you get this idea of it's the innocent victim that dies for you, the guilty. It's not that you are identifying the true, the true center of evil in the community, and if you could just expunge it, then you would be righteous. It's exactly the opposite in the scriptures. You're the problem with the community. It's your heart, and you've got to transfer your sins to the innocent victim who dies in your place. And then roll on to John the Baptist, and he points in John chapter 1 to Jesus, and he says, behold, there's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And René Girard has spoken very profoundly about how Christianity is the inversion of every other culture's understanding of sacrifice. Every other culture identifies the scapegoat in a very negative sense as that which needs to be destroyed in the community so that we righteous ones can continue. Instead, what you see at the cross is he's the only innocent one, and everyone else who kills him, we are the guilty ones. We are the problem. And so now we can never scapegoat people with a clear conscience. We can never point to the outsider as the problem, because we've always got those three fingers pointing straight back at ourselves. And so, the civilization that is built by an adherence to the cross is extremely different. And it is not the self-righteousness of trying to expunge the evil person over there. Instead, it's the admission, it's the mea culpa. It's I am a great sinner, and I've needed Christ's sacrifice. And so, yeah, you see very different values erupting within the Christian revolution. Values such as a kind of an anti-hypocrisy and a sense of laying bare our guilt, laying bare our sins, and honesty about that, and a lifting up of the victim, a lifting up of the marginalized and the despised, because God showed up exactly in that guise.
That's true. And it's like Jesus works in the pits and not the pedestals. So he was down there with the prostitutes and the tax collector and all these sinners.
Right. Yeah.
So that's fascinating.
A total inversion. Yeah. And think of the vertiginously steep hierarchy of being in the kind of the Greco-Roman world. And you've got, Caesar at the top, who is the son of God, right? Caesar Augustus is son of God. And when he died, he ascended to heaven. That was kind of the Roman emperor cult was the mirror image of the Christian story, in which might is right, and Jesus utterly upends it, utterly inverts it. And what Tom Holland says, as a classicist, he looks back to the Greco-Roman world and says it is a terrifyingly alien world. Julius Caesar was slaughtering 1 million Gauls, enslaving 1 million more, and he's not embarrassed about it. This is his boast. And we look back at classical civilization, and now we come to see it. If we have eyes to see it, now we see it as this incredibly different kind of civilization, and the difference between then and now is Jesus Christ. And if you can't handle that, says Tom Holland, you're not dealing honestly with history. So he's a fascinating guy.
Yeah, no, he really is. And so I want to say I have a question here from Hate Love Nothing. He or she, I'm not sure exactly which, but I says, I have a question about cell death. Was it not present in Eden? And so I've always thought that animals could have died before Adam and Eve committed the first sin. But it sounds like what you said was you might think differently on that.
Oh, within the scriptural narrative, I was just the first death recorded within Genesis 3 is that. So yeah, within the story, within the narrative, what we've got is because it's fascinating. Genesis 2, you've got on the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Well, Adam and Eve don't, their hearts don't stop beating the minute they eat the fruit, but there was a heart that stopped beating, and it wasn't theirs. So within the story, it's telling us the story of sacrifice. Yeah, and of course it did start the process of decay. So their bodies started probably aging and decaying, and then eventually dying. And so we certainly had that. Yes. So I wanted to see if we could go to the other topic that I really wanted to talk about today, and I'm very interested in. See, I think here's what I quickly think about abortion. I initially drove a friend to an abortion clinic in my 20s. So I'm not casting judgment on people for being pro-choice or for falling for this idea that it's just a termination of a pregnancy or just clumps of cells, because I actually also had been duped, and I was thinking like that. And it wasn't until I was pregnant with my second son when I was told that because he had 2 soft markers for Down syndrome, and I was 38 years old at the time, and they said, but don't worry. And this was at 15 weeks. So I could see a pretty much fully formed little body, little teeny, cute little hands and a little nose and all that stuff. And she said, oh, don't worry. You can terminate the pregnancy if it turns out the amnio comes back and he's positive for Down syndrome. And I thought, that is ridiculous. I'll never, how do you talk about my son like that? And so I went back home and I started studying what it was going to be like to be a Down mom. And my husband and I decided we are definitely going to keep our baby, no matter what the situation is. And he was born without Down syndrome. He didn't have any other symptoms or anything like that. And he's thriving today. Everything's great. But it made me think to myself, wait a second, there's a certain group of people who are dehumanizing other humans so that we can justify and rationalize this idea. And it goes against everything we know to be true. Like I put down this little note. So human life begins at conception. We can agree to that. We agree here in the United States that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this idea that babies, unborn babies,
should have a right to life, and it should not be less valuable than the mother's desire for liberty. And so, and if people are in the crowd and they're thinking, well, what about cases of rape? Less than 1%. I'll give you, we don't make rules based on exceptions. It's like, what about cases of self-defense in a murder? Well, that again is an exception. The rule is you don't murder. And so that's my whole case for pro-life in a nutshell. And I wanted to see what your thoughts are on those kind of topics.
Well, in a sense, we haven't switched topics. This is entirely in keeping with the conversation we've been having, that Jesus Christ became a single cell in Mary's womb. The Son of the Father, the eternal Son of the Father, became a single cell in Mary's womb. Right there, you have every reason to be pro-life. People sometimes ask me, why am I pro-life? And I say, well, two reasons really, Christmas and Easter. Okay, at Christmas, we believe that Jesus was incarnate at a certain point. And we don't say he was incarnate when he was born. And we don't say he was incarnate when he was 2 years old or 12 years old or anything of the sort. Luke chapter 1 says that what is conceived in you is from the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. And we say in the creeds, conceived by the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. And so it's actually a Christian heresy to say that the Son of God assumed a humanity that was already existent. We don't think that there was a man, Jesus of Nazareth, who then got assumed into divinity. Mm-hmm. What we say is that the eternal Son of God assumed a humanity at a certain point. Well, at what point? We know at what point. At conception. Mm-hmm. So life begins at conception. Theologically speaking, life begins at conception. And then, so I'm pro-life because of Christmas. I'm pro-life because of Easter as well. Because what do we see at the cross? What we see at the cross is, in the language of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, is that God dignifies and he exalts what is not. I'm trying to think of the language of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, but he calls the things that are not as though they are, and it's this whole theology of the cross that what the Greeks and the Jews think of as glorious and as wise, those things are inverted at the cross. That according to the Bible, the most glorious, the most powerful and the wisest thing you've ever seen is Jesus stripped naked in utter weakness. And that is where the true glory of God is. And I think the real reason, if we're very honest with ourselves, the real reason why we don't want to accord the unborn with the full rights that the rest of us have is because they're weak. They're voiceless. And they're silent. We can get rid of them. And no one kicks up a fuss because they are unseen. Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, what's changing so much of the conversation around abortion is that we're getting better and better. You know, we just used to have these very vague kind of sonogram images that you know, is that a human being? Is that not? And now we're seeing these like 3D images. And they're like, they are us. What are we doing to us? And so I think abortion is kind of it's a theology of glory, to use the old kind of Lutheran categories. He said, you know, there's two ways that you can think of God. You can think of God purely in terms of power, and therefore we ascend to God through our own strengths. Or you can think of God according to the cross, and actually we are the weak ones, and he had to come all the way down. Mm-hmm. All the way down to be a single cell in Mary's womb and to die on that cross. And we've got to be theologians of the cross. And the whole one of the great problems with being a theologian of glory is that you feel like you've got to always ascend towards deity. You've got to ascend towards strength. And unfortunately, this is the outcome of the pro-choice argument. The pro-choice argument is, yes, we will accord human dignity to members of the human family as long as they're strong enough, as long as they have this level of capacity. Once they reach this level of capacity, then all those rights that are enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, then we will accord them with those rights. But they've got to earn it. And isn't that the tragedy of the whole thing? You're asking members of the human family to earn their humanity, and you're saying that those, for instance, with a condition like Down syndrome, are from the outside disqualified until they can prove themselves worthy of rights, worthy of their humanity. That's a pretty Roman understanding of the world. The Romans were very happy to expose their infants, and especially girls. And even today, sex-selective abortion is used primarily against girls. Of course it is. It's a pagan practice, and it has been a pagan practice in pretty much every single civilization. It's a human universal. Abortion, stroke, exposure of infants. Actually, we are the weird ones. Christian civilization is this weird thing in honoring the despised and the weak and saying to them, you don't have to earn your humanity. It's a gift. Because we know the God who has said to us, you don't have to earn your status. As weak and despised as you are, it's all given to you as a gift. So I see the pro-life cause as being a very tangible expression of the good news of Jesus.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think you're pointing to a couple of really important things. I wanted to say, so in our country in 1973, Roe v. Wade was passed, and that was a Supreme Court decision to allow abortions until the baby's viable. And so that was the idea of up to 20 weeks generally. And then states passed their various laws that related to that. But the thing about that is, since then, 60 million people have been aborted. And that's as much as the population of Italy. I mean, this is significant. It's a whole country, or twice the population of Canada or something like that. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because the way the Supreme Court justices decided to justify this is they claim that the baby inside the womb is not a person yet. They didn't confer personhood, because that's how they could be consistent with our 14th Amendment and our Declaration of Independence. And so it's this idea that your personhood is magically conferred after you pass through the birth canal. And I think that's so ridiculous.
Yeah. It is. It's an anti-humanist position. And so, if people want to be humanist, I want to be a humanist. I want to, in the words of Esther O'Reilly, I want to steal back humanism for Christianity. It's ours. It belongs to us. And I think it is a grotesque betrayal of humanism to claim that you're a humanist, and to be not only, and many aren't just content with the death of 50 million unborn children in the world every year. Many aren't just content with that, but champion it as something that ought to be protected, and it's good to be pro-choice. It seems to me to be a terrifyingly pagan way of viewing the human person. You are saying that human beings need to earn their humanity, and that the place that ought to be the place of greatest protection is the deadliest place on planet Earth for any member of the human family to be.
You're right. In fact, I've even heard in some statistics in New York City, it's more dangerous to be an unborn Black child inside a mother's womb than it is to be a Black man on the outside or a Black woman on the outside. And that's pretty darn scary. That actually, a lot of times, some of the abortions are really devastating the Black population here in our country, and some of the people like that. We'd have many more people walking on our planet right now in a much more diverse culture had we not had so many abortions. It's awful.
Yeah, and when it comes to conditions like Down syndrome, I mean, it was reported in the press here that Scandinavian countries like Iceland had no Down syndrome's births in the last 5 years, and some of the reports sounded like people had found a cure for Down syndrome. People have not found a cure for Down syndrome. They have found children with Down syndrome and exterminated them.
Yeah,
it's
tragic.
I mean, on any definition of genocide, that's a genocide.
It is. That is. And actually, even going back to Down syndrome, what I did read in my little investigation that I did when I thought I might actually be a Down syndrome mom is I looked at all the love that those children bring to their parents. They're from what I've seen, they're just very loving, kind, beautiful people. And so to eliminate that population is shameful.
Yeah. I mean, you can fall into a trap on that one, in that, I mean, it's absolutely true that in psychological studies, they are the happiest people on planet Earth. Like 99% of those with Down syndrome are happy or very happy with their lives. So on any kind of psychological measure, they are the happiest people on planet Earth. But let's not make the reason why they should live.
You're right. Now I'm doing that
psychologically happy.
You're right.
It's like, let's make the reason that they should live that they are us and we are them. And it's a profoundly humanist cause, I would have thought. Now, on the other side, the pro-choice side, Tom Holland points this out. All our culture wars are intramural Christian culture wars in one sense. In that the values that are espoused on both sides of this culture war ultimately derive from Christianity. And you think, well, how could that be? Because Christians have always, like Macrina, back in the 5th century was saving children from being exposed, and she was a great saint in the church, and that's always been the church's position to stand against abortion, to stand against exposure. How can the pro-choice side be Christian? Well, in a sense, it is because our sense of the autonomy of a woman and a woman's rights over her own body, they have developed along very Christian lines as well. It was through this weird doctrine of lifelong matrimony that suddenly women were accorded with so much dignity and started the cause of women on the trajectory towards equality and rights. And the idea that the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 that a husband, he said, a wife's body does not belong to her, but belongs to her husband as well. And at that stage, all the Greco-Roman kind of ethicists would all sort of applaud and say, yes, absolutely, that's right. But then he absolutely mirrors it. And he then says, and the husband's body does not belong to him himself, but belongs equally to the wife. And everyone's like, what? That is new. That is, so a woman's body, what, are you saying that there needs to be consent? And Paul's like, yeah, absolutely. There needs to be consent. Do you mean to say, would a Roman? I mean, the sexual economy of Rome was based on systematic exploitation, especially of women and girls and boys, and it was absolutely rife. There are 25 Latin words for prostitute. Because it was just absolutely woven into the culture, and of course, slaves were your property and became sex slaves in every way imaginable. It was the Christian, the sexual revolution that really meant liberation was the first century sexual revolution. The first century sexual revolution, where Jesus is like, okay, men, you are to discipline your desires. You are to be a one-woman man for life, and that's your lot. If you want to have any kind of sexual expression, you are tied to your one woman and to the offspring from your love relationship for life. It's the taming of rampant male sexuality that lifelong monogamy brought to the world that has led to so much transformation. I'm reading a book by Joseph Heinrich called The Weirdest People on the Planet, where he's from a secular psychologist's point of view. He's like, well, the difference in the West is Christianity, and the difference he can point to in Christianity is this idea of lifelong matrimony. And that you marry way beyond your clan. You don't marry your cousin. You don't marry your second cousin. That burst in Christian civilization, the idea of like equality between the sexes. It really did, and it birthed the idea of consent as utterly foundational to our sexual ethic. It did all, and therefore that women have rights to their own bodies. And they are not to be used by others. So these ideas have a profoundly Christian origin. And the pro-choice argument, at its best, I think it fails, but the pro-choice argument at its best is about the honoring of, as they see it, the weaker partner, the woman, right? Who must be protected from rampant male violence and intrusion. Okay, placed in those terms, those are some thoroughly Christian impulses, and they should be acknowledged to be thoroughly Christian impulses. But then you need to take the broader view, because there is the woman, yes. There's also a human being inside the woman. And what about their rights? What about their bodily autonomy?
Exactly.
But I think one thing it's worth mentioning is that there are profoundly Christian foundations to the arguments of the other side, and it's important to lay those bare.
Yeah, and I think I've heard a lot of people try to argue with the kidney idea and say, well, you wouldn't force a woman to give her kidney to a child, so why should you force a woman to give up her uterus? And I heard the counter argument. I actually was on, whose channel was that? Matt Fradd's. I was listening to Matt Fradd talk to somebody named Stephanie. I didn't catch her last name, but she was talking about that she felt like Jesus had given her a message on that particular argument, and she said, well, the kidney is made for the one purpose, and the purpose is to expunge, junk or whatever. And the uterus is made for a baby. The uterus is not made for the mother. The uterus is made for the child. And in the process of menstruation, each month the uterus is preparing to house this child. And so each month you menstruate, that sort of thing happens. And so
yeah, it's a thoroughly dehumanizing, and it's like, has anyone actually held a child in their arms who makes these sorts of arguments?
No.
The most famous kind of analogy is the violinist analogy. Have you heard this? There's a famous violinist, and in their sleep, someone is strapped into their body and is used for kind of human dialysis by this other person. Are they able to? And this other person might be healed from whatever condition they're in after 9 months. Is the violinist obligated to remain attached to this total stranger who is a parasite on them? And you're just like, okay, well, every analogy has disanalogies within it. Every no analogy is perfect. Okay, let's grant that. but this whole scenario depends on a violent parasite attaching itself to, and you're like, is that really is that really how you think of children? That tells you more about that person's doctrine of humanity than anything else, that they think it's a relevant similarity, that a sick parasite is basically their equivalent of the human child. They're your child. I mean, what? Yeah, anyway.
No, I can't even see. I see the same thing. I just see the value of human life. And just for my kids, I remember I was pregnant 3 times, and the first pregnancy I lost to a miscarriage. And I just was totally heartbroken over that. And I remember just being a complete mess for a couple of months. I was so upset over that. And then thankfully, all of a sudden I got pregnant with my second child. Pregnant with my first child, actually, he was born, and then another one. And I felt so blessed, so incredibly blessed. And I feel like probably the happiest time in my life were the 9 months in each of those situations where I was pregnant. I remember playing music to my kids and doing all this stuff to try to eat right and do all these healthy things to make sure that my kids were given the best opportunity as possible. And so yeah.
Yeah. And people know that, and you don't have to be pro-life to know that you grieve a miscarriage in a way that you do not grieve the passing of a kidney stone. Okay, people know that. And when Meghan Markle tragically lost the child that she was having with Harry, I mean, there was an outpouring of grief and support, and people were saying what is entirely right to say, in that there is grief, there is mourning. Why? Because this is the passing of a human. It's not the passing of a kidney stone. We know this, and just as a society, we do ourselves a great disservice if we can't give to people the language that is most natural in this situation. If every time I see a pregnant woman, I don't say, "How's your product of conception doing?" I say, "How's the baby?" And we all did. And you don't have to be pro-life to speak in those terms,
right?
But there's an abortion of language happening as well. There's violence done to language. I was speaking to Professor John Wyatt last year. He's professor of neonatal pediatrics, and he just says it's this bizarre thing. The sonograph person. This is what happens in the National Health Service in the UK anyway. The sonograph person at 16 weeks, 20 weeks, or whatever, is doing the scan. But the first question they ask the mother is, do you want to keep the child? And if the answer is no, then the screen is tilted decidedly, towards
Oh, that's
the person doing
terrible.
this. Because and the language is instantly dehumanized.
Ugh.
And what do you want to do with the pregnancy? But if the woman says, yes, we're looking forward to having the child, then the screen is tilted towards the mother. She sees the child. It all becomes personalized. And suddenly what's inside the womb becomes a person based on what? Based on the will of the strong. Now, Nietzsche's doing cartwheels at this point. Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's the will of the strong, And that's why, to the degree that the pro-choice argument is founded on, we want to protect the weak and the marginalized. It is absolutely right. And you do not want women to be considered as, mere carriers of children who can be abused and can be told what to do and all that kind of stuff. And that impetus, there's something very Christian about wanting not to be forcing those who have less power to do what they do not want to do. It's profoundly Christian impulse. It's just, you need to take the wider perspective, because it's not just the woman. There's another human being, and you're about to use a heck of a lot of force against that human being. So let's try and get in touch with that humanism. Yeah.
Yeah, no, those are great points. The same people, what I found that I think is really interesting is the same people who protest the death penalty are often the ones who are pro-choice. And so they would say you're going after the guilty in favor, and the innocent are punished and the guilty are set free. And so it's an inversion of what it should be.
Yeah, I mean, the States is quite different in terms of how kind of views on social issues kind of line up on things. And often, the critique of many in the States is usually, well, you say you're pro-life, but you're also for the death penalty, and there's all sorts of brickbats that are thrown at pro-lifers, like, you're only pro-life in the womb, and then they're on their own once they get out of the womb, which from what I can tell, there are many times more pregnancy centers in the US than there are abortion clinics, and they are run overwhelmingly by Christians, by those who believe in life. I myself am an adoptive father because I believe in life in its fullness, and
that's great.
And I mean, one of the reasons is well, how can I can't shoot my mouth off about this issue without wanting to be part of the solution to it. And it's an easy criticism to make of those who voice pro-life arguments. But what have you done lately?
And have you adopted? A lot of people try to clump the foster care system in with private adoption agencies too, because I looked at American adoptions and I found that it says up to 36 couples are there for every one child put up for adoption. And so the foster system is tragic, though, because there are a lot of kids who, unfortunately, that their parents have had to relinquish their rights to the child because of various reasons, and so they're put up into the foster system, which that does have kids in it, and people should consider adopting those. But it can be challenging because then people are worried that those children might have some issues that they won't be able to address as parents. Maybe they're not able to address that kind of stuff.
Right. But what is the profoundly Christian thing to do? As we walk in the way of Jesus, then surely we sacrifice ourselves and we sacrifice our freedoms and for the blessing of the weak and the marginalized and the despised and those who no one else would pick. Because we were the weak and the marginalized, and God shouldn't have picked us, but He did. Praise Him. And so I mean, so I to be honest, I don't have a lot of time for people who are just pro-life for the sake of winning an argument. It should be a profoundly humane position that is backed up by a humane life that is lived for the other, So let's get into adoption. Let's get into foster care. Just as Christians always, have looked after the widow and the orphan and the alien. Let's continue to look after the widow, the orphan, and the alien. And there are plenty of opportunities to do that.
Yeah, I just think of one of my coworkers. She's a single mother of an adopted foster child of a different race. The foster child is a different race, and she's bringing him up and just giving him a really amazing life. She's put him up in private school, and I commend that so much. I think that's just absolutely fabulous that she was willing to do that and go the extra mile. Her little child is just a blessing to be around.
Yeah. Oh, it's glorious. It is glorious to be a part of this flow of adopting love, and it has helped me to understand more of my own adoption into God's family,
Hmm.
to understand the father's heart a lot more as I experience, an adoptive father's heart towards my son, and let's not look at it through rose-tinted glasses. It's hard. It's difficult. As it was for Christ, it was excruciating in
Hmm.
order to bring us into God's family. It is difficult. It's those difficulties that you mentioned earlier don't just go away because we have a sunny view of Christian adoption. So it's hard, but it's glorious, and it puts you in touch with what Jesus said, and Jesus says we give up our lives in order to find them again.
Hmm.
And it's as we walk that way of sacrifice, we find that the sacrifice that I'm involved with is not paying God back. I could never pay God back. God doesn't need my good deeds, my neighbor does. So what I do is pay it forwards, and adoption is one way of doing it, but there are all sorts of ways of really fostering a family of adopting, inclusive, welcoming, hospitable love. And
Hmm.
that's really what we're called to do, which is an interesting challenge, I think, in the church, because it's often seen that the pro-life position is a conservative, traditional, religious position to hold. And viewed from one perspective, I suppose it is. I actually tend to think it's actually incredibly liberal and progressive as well,
Hmm.
viewed from another perspective, because I am applying the liberal values of humanism to the entirety of the human family. And I think it's an incredibly revolutionary and progressive view, actually, to be for life from womb to tomb. But what it means is, I think,
The tomb. I like that.
right. Well, but I think we need to detach it from the political arguments that are so often happening, because what it requires of the church is actually to loosen our appreciation for the traditional family. Because usually what tends to happen is, okay, here is a kind of a package of political, social, and moral values that you're given. And in the States, you're given a slightly different package to the one
Hmm.
that you're given within, global Christianity. Global Christianity looks on America as weird, different. You have your own struggles. We have our own struggles. Everybody's got their own struggles. But the package that seems to go together in the States is, if you're pro-life, you're also pro-gun, you're also pro-capital punishments, you're also pro-traditional family values, which is kind of the nuclear family.
Hmm.
Mum, dad, 2.2 kids. Whereas I think to be roundly pro-life pushes against some of that cultural narrative, because it requires you to have a non-traditional family. We have a non-traditional family. I am
Hmm.
not into traditional family values, because there's nothing traditional about adoption. Okay, many cultures have, in Islam, adoption is outlawed because it's not natural, right? And this
Really?
is
I didn't know that.
right, yeah. And you can psychologize Muhammad and his experience of adoption and that sort of thing as well. But adoption is not natural. And I don't believe in traditional family values, because I'm raising, in one sense, somebody else's biological child right now.
Hmm.
Um, and so it requires us to push against some of the narratives that we might think we have to follow. Because I'm pro-life, I must be pro-traditional family. Well, actually, to be pro-life, I need to have this much more expansive vision for what a family truly is. But I think following that revolution will be putting me in the footsteps of Jesus, and moving our civilization forwards But yeah, just a random thought.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I'm seeing, I have Nathan in the chat. He's Digital Gnosis. I don't know if you can see the chat, but he
I
has a
can't,
point
no.
here because
Hey,
he says
Nathan.
he was adopted, and he says, and I don't know if you know him, but he says, I hope that Glenn looks into the work of Nancy Verrier around the separation trauma that adopted children face and doesn't turn their trauma into an opportunity for him to appear virtuous. So that's.
Yeah, send me that, Nathan. I do know Nathan. Yeah. Send me that. Yeah, I'd love to read it. But yes, lots of done lots of reading, and yeah, he's so yeah, my son is 3, so we've got lots of that stuff ahead of us. But yeah, we don't have rose tinted glasses about it, and yeah, love to read that stuff.
Well, I have to say, our former pastor, he left and went to another church. He felt called to go to a different church, but he adopted a little girl from China. And China is one place where a lot of, just like you said, with gender selection, a lot of girls are put up for adoption more so than boys. And a lot of girls are aborted, like you said, more so probably than boys, because they're trying to keep as few children as possible. And and so he did that. And I thought I really like that he did that. So give this girl another opportunity. But he was telling us in the church about how challenging that was for him, because they came back on the plane and the girl was familiar only with Chinese language, Mandarin. And so it was just a challenge to try to even start the whole communication process. So.
Right. Yeah. And there are different cultural experiences of it. I mean, adoption is a real rarity in Australia, where I'm from. Largely because of what we now call the stolen generation. So 100 years ago, there were, and more recently, there were horrible instances of Aboriginal children being stolen from their parents and raised with good white parents.
Oh, geez.
And that's that sort of colonialistic, attitude is horrendous, and therefore there is no political appetite whatsoever for any kind of forced adoption.
Wow. Let me ask you this. You were in Australia, you said, for half your life, and you've been in UK for half your life. What do you make as the pros and cons of each of those places? I'm curious, because I've been to England, but I've never been to Australia, and so I don't know much about it.
Oh, you must go. Yeah, Australia's a fantastic country. It's very easy to live in, much more easygoing than the UK, just socially, economically, just personality-wise. The UK is, well, it's, as you can see, I'm quite cold in here right now, and it's a very indoorsy culture. And the great stuff about that is you sit around a fire in a pub and you nurse your pints, and there's a great kind of culture that and spirit that sort of grows up around that. Australia is much more expansive and wide open spaces, and you kick a ball around on the outside, and they've both got wonderful things going for them. And I better stop talking before I offend one or the other of them.
Oh, that's fun. No, I have a funny question from Hate Love Nothing. It says, how many amazing animals have you petted in Australia?
My daughter is loving the fact, like, she's discovered all these YouTube videos about the most poisonous animals in the world, the most dangerous animals in the world, and of course, all of these top 10 lists, like 9 of them are all in Australia. And so
yeah, I heard crocodiles are kind of bad over there, aren't they?
Crocodiles. Oh, that's the least of your troubles, SJ. There's,
well, I live in a place where there's alligators, so. Yes.
You're in Tampa, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Carol Baskin's place. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah. You'll get the crazies down here. I know people always on Twitter, I find this stuff like Florida man and all this. I'm like, oh, do they think we're just total weirdos? Florida has 21 million people, by the way, so it's pretty significant in size.
and all of them are mad, I'm sure.
All of them are crazy. Does anybody have? I know we're coming up. We've gone about an hour, and I don't know how much time you have, but I wanted to see if are you willing to answer a couple questions if anyone has questions?
I've got to go pick up my son from daycare, but yeah. Let's give it another 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes is perfect. Yeah. So if anyone has a question, just go ahead and throw it forward. You mentioned something on Martin Luther too that I thought was really fascinating, that he said at the end of his life about how a lot of what he did was the power of the word rather than, say, the power of the sword in changing people's minds. And so I thought that was pretty insightful.
Yeah, and at his best, he's kind of channeling Jesus. He said some quite repugnant things right before his death as well. But in terms of, as he looked back on the Protestant Reformation, what he was struck by was the fact that he opposed popes and princes, and without a sword. All he did was preach and write God's word, and the word did the work. And so, again, one of the gifts to Western civilization, I think, has been this very strong demarcation between the power of persuasion and the power of force, the power of the sword and the power of the word. And what you see in the New Testament is this overturning of Jesus saying, "Put away the sword; those who live by the sword will die by the sword." And at the same time, he said his word is like seed that grows. And then the Apostle Paul says the word of God is the sword of the Spirit. And this renunciation of force and compulsion in preference for words and persuasion. And it's interesting. Yeah, we're getting a little bit of a those things are being elided a lot more. Words are now violence, and I think to the degree that we walk away from that quite Christian understanding of a real difference between words and violence, we're going to get into more and more problems, I think.
Yeah, the whole free speech issue, that's another day and could take a long to talk about. I hate, love, nothing. Actually, I want to say hi to all the people in the chat, by the way, the Maverick, Danny, hate, love, nothing, Digital Gnosis, anyone else I've seen in here earlier that came in and left, like writer John Buck. There was a question that came in from Danny that I want to ask too, but because he was asking about the value, like the individual value, and how do we know that humans have value, intrinsic value? And so I'll get to that in 1 second, but first I want to. It says, how would he reconcile going into the world with being apart? Should one suffer non-adherence mid-rescue attempt? I'm not exactly sure what that's asking, but maybe it's this idea of should we conform to the ways of the world?
In I'm going to say Isaiah, because I'm speaking to an American. In Isaiah, chapter 65, you've got that phrase which in the King James Bible is translated "the holier than thou." And we've all got this sense of the repugnant idea of Christians and spiritual types being holier than thou, holding their nose, thinking that they're better than everybody else. What's fascinating is that phrase comes from the lips of the Lord himself in Isaiah 65, and he can't stand the holier than thou types. It's God himself who's saying, "They are a stench in my nostrils." Because 3 sentences earlier, he says, "All day long I've held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people." That's what the Lord's like. The Lord's holiness is actually reaching out to that which is unholy. The light of the world shines into that which is dark. There is an effusiveness, there's an outgoingness to what God is like. And so his holiness should never be set at odds with his missionary love. Therefore, you could think of God as just entirely set apart, and therefore what we ought to do is we ought to suck people out of the world and suck them up to the holy place. Beam me up, Scotty, get me out of here. And that's what holiness is. And maybe you're an evangelistic type, so you hold your nose and you go and get a few filthy sinners and you try to drag them up into the holy space. I think that's exactly the wrong way around. I think even from Isaiah 65, you've got the holiness of God is actually his fierce, passionate, jealous, committed love for the other that is transformative, that is different from the world, but it's an outreaching kind of thing. And so as we are swept up into that kind of holiness, I think there is a flow from the living God out to the ends of the world. And we're not to be the same as the world, but we are to go towards the world, just like light goes towards the darkness. We are to head out there into the world. So I would frame things in those terms, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that even the Good Samaritan, this idea where the holy people were walking past this person who was in need of help, and a Good Samaritan came and helped him out. And so that's the holy obviously think that it is a self-righteous idea. And it's also even spoken of when you have the prodigal son and the brother.
Yes. Yeah. And it was the priests that held their nose and went off to do their temple duty. And passed on by, and that is not holiness. That is not true holiness. True holiness is to do the Good Samaritan thing.
Yeah. So Danny did repost this question. I kind of caught it earlier, and it says, if you define human, wait, let me just put it right here. if you define human beings as being intrinsic, then that seems to be equating a normative fact with a descriptive fact, or the naturalistic fallacy.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a faith position that human beings are in the image of God. We are in the image of God because God says so. And I'm not trying to put human beings under the microscope. I'm not trying to say that you can find somewhere, as you map the genome of humanity, that you can find rights somewhere encoded in the DNA. It is a faith position.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested by Andrew Klavan. He was a secular Jew who came to faith in Jesus, and he said the biggest jump of faith, in fact, he says the only leap of faith he ever had to make was saying that human beings had intrinsic value. He said everything else unpacked from there. And his journey to faith, one of the elements of it, it's fascinating. He's written his memoirs, The Great Good Thing. It's a really good read. He's a fantastic writer. And he says he was reading the Marquis de Sade, the man who named sadism, and just the outworkings of his atheistic mindset led the Marquis de Sade down one path. And he just remembers reading that and saying, no, can't go down there. But the only other thing to do is to see this inherent intrinsic worth in human beings. Tom Holland speaks of something very similar in reading Nietzsche, and he reads Nietzsche, and he says, okay, Nietzsche is the thoroughgoing skeptic of Christianity. Humanism is Christianity light. Nietzsche wanted to critique everything, and he ended up with his nihilism. And Tom Holland's going, no thanks, I'm not going to go down that road. And you think of someone like Jordan Peterson, and he kind of looks at the Holocaust and he looks at the gulags, and he's like, well, no, can't go down there.
Right.
And he talks about the divine spark within humans and that sort of thing. So I'm not saying that any of this is naturally obvious. I am saying it's the kind of assumption from which everything else follows. So yeah, he might want to come back on that. But
yeah, I like that. Now, can you tell me the name? Klavan, did you say was the name?
Andrew Klavan, Klavan, as they always say on his show. He's got a show on the Daily Wire. But yeah, The Great Good Thing is a really good read.
Great Good Thing. Great. I'm just writing that down so I don't forget, because I like to buy these books and read them and absorb them. But yeah, I agree with all of your points on that kind of thing. I think that the idea of communism, that did speak to how many people, 120 million people dying in the past century, this idea that individuals don't have value, it's all the group. And I think that that's kind of what we're getting back, kind of circling back around and saying the thing about Christianity is we said, no, individuals do have value. In fact, we have equal value and equal opportunities and should be given equal opportunities. And so I think that's pretty good. So I know you've got to go because you've got to go pick up your son. So do you want to have any parting shots on maybe how people, I've already put your links to your channel in the chat, but great. Maybe how they can reach you or what you're going to be working on next or any shows you might appear on?
Yeah, I think people who watch you might be interested in our Reset series. So we're talking to really interesting people like Tom Holland, for instance, and going back to the beginning, going back to Genesis, and often talking about issues to do with the image of God. So yeah, go to our channel, Speak Life Media, on YouTube, and every Friday night we've got fascinating interviews. And in, I guess, 3.5 hours, we've got Professor Alec Ryrie, who is just a fascinating professor of Christian history, and his lectures online are just superb, really, unpacking a lot of the Tom Holland Dominion thesis. He's a professor up at Durham, and when I say lectures, I don't mean boring, dull ones. Of course, you don't believe that lectures are boring or dull, do you? That's your day job, isn't it, SJ? But
I'm not allowed to make boring, dull lectures. In fact, I won't lecture. I don't like lecturing. I like doing experiential stuff. So
okay, yeah.
I intersperse lots of my lectures.
Yeah. Well, catch Alec Ryrie tonight, and then maybe that'll give you a taste for some more.
Good. Well, great. Yeah, I definitely will do that. I didn't even know you had that coming up, and I haven't listened to him before. So great. So everybody, just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. So thank you so much, everybody. Please like, subscribe, and then definitely go over to Glen's channel, Speak Life, subscribe to his channel, and make sure you watch that video tonight. So awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, SJ.
I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast.